Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Zoom presentation organized by the University of Aruba, hosted by the Center for Lifelong Learning. And my name is Deborah Alexander. I'm the coordinator for the Center for Lifelong Learning here at the university, for those of you who don't know me. And today is Tuesday, November 24th of the year 2020. Before we start with this presentation, I'd like to draw your attention to the following on the next screen. So please take note that I see some of you have already used the chat box to let us know who you are. I recommend you just send a short shout out, your name, and either the organization that you're representing or your function, interest in this webinar, just general remarks during the presentation. Use the Q&A box specifically for your questions. These will be answered at the end of the presentation. So, and post them in either English or Dutch, but preferably English, as Jim, your Dutch is a bit rusty, but we'll do our best to help you out with that. Take note that at the end of this webinar, once you close your box, a pop-up screen will appear, which you are required or requested to fill in the evaluation form. And do know that this recording will be made available within a short period of time, not next week, because it has to be edited, certain things have to be done, but it definitely will be made available on our YouTube link and also in our newsletter that appears. So today's topic is, as you will see from the next slide, small island tourism economies and tourism area life cycle. Why Aruba and St. Martin have exceeded their carrying capacity. A very interesting question and relevant one. And our speaker for today, and the one who obtained his PhD on this topic, is no one other than Dr. Arjen Aberts. So who is he? If you don't know who he is, he's a resident of the Dutch Caribbean, or has been a resident of the Dutch Caribbean for the past 22 years. He's also active as a policy advisor and as an educator on Aruba, St. Martin, and currently Curacao, where he's zooming in with us. Not unknown to the university, was a lecturer at our finance and economics faculty from 1998 until 2001. And he recently defended his PhD thesis in September at the University of Amsterdam, and forms also the basis for this presentation. Also with us today, we have two co-panelists, also not unknown to the community of Aruba, Dr. James, also known as Jim Happel, and Dr. Luc Alofs. They will be asking our presenter some critical questions after his presentation, and we look forward to having your critical questions as well. Without further ado, Arjen, I'd like to give this presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. First of all, very good evening, bon noche to everyone tuned in to this webinar. I've been duly introduced, for which I thank the presenter. My appreciation to the University of Aruba and the Center for Lifelong Learning for giving me this opportunity. And as you just heard, I was working for the University of Aruba many years ago, many screens ago already, 18 years right now. So it's a pleasure to be back virtually. And indeed, I will guide you through the journey I made in my PhD research, of which the thesis that Deborah was just referring to is the end result. So the ideas, of course, for this thesis came up when I was living in Aruba and later in St. Martin, and I saw some interesting phenomena there and things that caught my eye. Actually, a couple of paradoxes that I will delve into later on, and that led to the idea to make this into a research project, to make the research project into a PhD thesis that I had the honor to defend just a few months ago. So what is it that is so fascinating about especially Aruba and Sint Maarten, and what sets them apart from the other islands in the Dutch Caribbean, or for that matter, in the wider Caribbean or in the world? So those were the questions I started asking. The eye-catching paradoxes, right? What is so special, what is so fascinating about those two islands in particular? Well, they have some commonalities that other islands don't have, right? Aruba as well as Sint Maarten are among the islands of the Dutch Caribbean and the wider region the most highly specialized and developed tourism destinations in terms of intensity of tourism, in terms of volume, either measured in proportion to their surface area or measured in proportion to their population. Of course, there are other islands with more tourism, but they have other sources of income as well. But no islands are this intensely developed and this one-sidedly developed. And that leads us to what you saw in the title, the term small island tourism economies. So, seemingly successful islands, high tourism numbers, yet a paradox, quality of life, as well as productivity in an economic sense, stagnated. That was the first thing, right? Success, yes, yet not really success. Then the second one, being small islands, it is clear that the surface area is limited. So both islands have outgrown their area, their surface area, pretty soon with over-tourism and overpopulation. Yet tourism in both islands kept growing in volume years and decades after, the healthy tipping point, you might say, had been reached. So that was another paradox. And followed up by a third one. So if you go and look at, did nobody realize this? Did nobody realize that, both islands developed far beyond the point of comfortable development? Yes, they did actually. So reports and analyses were produced as of the 1990s and onwards by the same governments who then turned around and continue along the same lines as they always did. So that's another paradox. Although the limitations of the development model were known, nobody really reacted to that knowledge and kept developing as they did, only along a slightly deteriorating path. So realizing that, I started to delve into the analysis of how this came about. The first thing I mentioned just now, the first paradox, economic development, yet not really economic development. If you look at this graph, you see that we in economics, we like to measure development productivity as, for instance, by measuring real per capita GDP. And in both islands, that jumps up when tourism development sets off, and then it flatlines with some ups and downs for a few decades actually, and there is no real progress there. So actually the economy, the people working in the economy, the labor force, doesn't really get any more productive, which is a really bad sign for a developing economy. Yet volume grows enormously. So quantity yes, quality no. So looking somewhat closer at these islands, I already mentioned the term small island tourism economy. So actually, Sint Maarten and Aruba are not unique. There are other islands in the world fitting the same template, either in the Caribbean, like the Bahamas, Bermuda, in the Pacific, even in the Mediterranean. But even among those islands, if you look at the numbers, Aruba and Sint Maarten are right at the top where it comes to intensity of tourism development in relation to the surface area of the islands and in relation to their population. So no island in the world has as many tourists per resident as Sint Maarten has, not by a long shot. And is their trajectory unique then? Now that seems to develop along the lines of a known template as well, the tourism area life cycle, which I will refer some more a little later on. So yes, it's actually not unheard of, it's not unique, only within the group of islands developing this way, Aruba and Sint Maarten are actually very extreme examples. So how did it get so extreme and why did it continue? Was the governance structure of the islands a factor, right? For instance, the fact that they started out as part of the Netherlands Antilles. What did governments through the decades do about it to stimulate tourism growth? Did they do anything to manage tourism growth? And if so, was it successful? One of the questions that is coming back all the time within that framework is specialization, for instance. So is that one-sided specialization a good thing? Is focusing exclusively on tourism a good thing or a bad thing? And does it contribute to vulnerability, or does it perhaps promote resilience? And of course, the answer is a bit of both. This is a quick look at the concept of tourism area life cycle. I'm showing this because it's a really important theoretical background, and it's really applicable, as we will see, to the islands of Aruba and Sint Maarten. So most destinations, tourism destinations in the world, develop along these lines sooner or later. It's not a fixed timeline. Some are quicker, some are slower, of course. But amazingly, most destinations do follow the same path. And, you know, not surprisingly, both islands are firmly in the last stage of stagnation. So there's still some volume growth, right? But it's past the tipping point where the critical range of carrying capacity has been transgressed. And the question is then, where do we go from here, right? Do we stretch the stagnation phase? Do we go into decline? Or do we figure out a way to rejuvenate and start maybe a new cycle, a better cycle for the tourism product? So this is a quick look at some results of my research. Remember, I asked myself, what did governance, what did the role of government do in regard to the tourism development trajectory? So what you see is that the role of government, the same thing that was an advantage to tourism development in the early days, became a disadvantage, became a drawback in the later stages. So in both islands, with regard to the actors, right, the investors, the hotels in the tourism industry, the governments took the back seat and let the economy, free trade, laissez-faire, let the economy do its work. So when tourism and the economy grew and the population grew, governments, regardless of their political color, didn't turn out to be equipped to manage the much more intense, much bigger, much more complicated economies that then came into being. So the governance capacity fell short. So, you know, while tourism was being successful, while everything grew, population, economy, carrying capacity was exceeded, and where now a very active and managing government was needed, there was none. So the governance, the power of government just fell short. So then we have a stagnation phase combined with insufficient governance power. So the prospect of now all of a sudden switching to actively managing the tourism model and getting to that rejuvenation instead of into a decline, that prospect isn't particularly positive at this point in time. And that is before we got the COVID crisis. So So pointing towards the main findings of my research. So weak governance leads to quantity over quality. So, you know, the inability of several governments to actually manage the development path led to, you know, easy choices. So you see consistently more tourism product, but also gradually deteriorating quality, which is really not what you want, but it explains the lack of productivity growth. And on the other hand, there is a type of continuous forced growth. So to make the model, to keep the model attractive, it has to continuously grow. And I'll get to that later because that is the main finding of my research. And to grow, you need workforce, and for workforce, you need immigration. So the population has grown, and tremendously even, and that in turn aggravates the problems that's already there. So it's not just over tourism, it's also overpopulation and pressure on everything, pressure on infrastructure, pressure on public services such as education, healthcare, and everything else. So all of that combined, you know, presses on the governments, and the governments can't really handle that. So how is it possible that a model that really doesn't grow in productivity, it does grow in volume, so how is it possible that this model is still attractive to all the people involved? Is a question I ask myself, because if you look at the results of previous research, you see that most people are still on average happy with the results, and people generally move up in society. So how is that possible while the average stays the same? That seems impossible. Now, that led me to the proposal of the mandatory growth paradox. So what you see happening is the following. The two pyramids, the smaller pyramid and the larger pyramid. The smaller pyramid turns into the larger pyramid over time. That's the population growing, and the people, the working population, the labor force moving up career-wise and income-wise. So people do move up in terms of occupation. They do move up in terms of income. As you see, for instance, this is a very simplified model, but it turns out that locals, for instance, prefer certain types of jobs and move, for instance, out of hospitality, where they used to work, out of construction, out of trade, into education, into financial services, and into government. All the while also improving their income. Immigrants, same way, immigrants move up in society as well. But the total population grows as well through new immigration. So the bottom of the pyramid is constantly supplemented by new entrants into the game, by new people coming from the region. And that goes for St. Martin as well as Aruba, so different sources of immigration, of course. But filling up the pyramid at the bottom, and those people also improve their situation because they're much better off than in their country, than they were in their country of origin. So this is how you can explain that everybody individually improves, including those coming from immigration from surrounding countries, but the average of society, the middle of the pyramid, stays in the same place. So as I showed in the beginning, by showing that, for instance, per capita, real per capita GDP, or the average income per person, it has not increased over the years. So that is a very special situation, and it also explains, and that concludes my presentation, it explains the driver for continuous growth, the impetus to keep the model growing in order to keep creating opportunities for advancement for everybody who is already in the system. So instead of making the economy as a whole more productive. You make the economy bigger and you redistribute the earnings within the pyramid upwards, so that everybody, you know, cosmetically, everybody is indeed increasing their position. So that is a very special situation, very unique to these islands, and also reasonably unique in the world as well. So this is what I call the mandatory growth paradox, and it explains that in order to keep everybody happy, every government basically is forced to keep building new hotels that require new immigrant labor, that produce more taxes, that finance the nicer jobs in the top of the pyramid. So this is what, in a very small nutshell, the content of my PhD thesis. I have a few, let me look quickly at the clock. Yeah, I went over this is 20 minutes, so I have to stop here. I hope that I had a few remarks about post-COVID, but I'm pretty sure that we'll get to those instigated by the questions that are probably still to come. So I want to give the word back to Deborah now and my panelists.
Thank you, Arjen, for the interesting presentation. I was just going to say, if you wanted to finish this part, you're free with me to do so, because I could imagine that.
I'm saving it for now. I want the panelists to have their turn.
You want the panelists, yeah, because you are excited. I see they're on their seats and they're itching, you know. Let me start with the tourism man. You know, Jim, do you have any questions regarding this?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Arjen, for a really interesting presentation. I've been lucky enough to be able to look at the original document. And actually, I can remember meeting Arjen way back in 2016 when he was working on this thesis when I was with Harter. But one of the questions I had for Arjen was this whole challenge, paradox, and he addressed it, which is, should a country specialize or should it move towards diversification? And, you know, part of Arjen's findings were that, in fact, a small island tourism economy tends to be more resilient, can handle external shocks better than those countries that have got some degree of diversification. Now, given the situation that we have now, then the sense that we have two ways to go. We can attempt to really rebuild our tourism industry and return to the level of specialism that we had prior to COVID, or should government policy be much more inclined towards looking to diversifying the economy?
Thanks, Jim. Let me address that first, because indeed I glanced a little bit over the discussion about specialization and diversification in relation to resilience and vulnerability, which is in my thesis, but there's only so much time. But indeed, you know, let's connect that immediately to the post-COVID situation, which is an opportunity, perhaps, right, to reinvent the wheel of tourism. It is true, indeed, that previous research has shown that if you compare the small island tourism economies to similar size, similar income level economies, then the tourism ones are less vulnerable to external shocks by a considerable margin, which is why, because you're selling an end product to an end consumer, basically more or less directly, in an end consumer in the richer part of the world, instead of, for instance, raw materials or other stuff that is way more market vulnerable in an economic sense, and also structurally more vulnerable. You may produce a raw material or an agricultural product that tomorrow falls out of the market because something synthetic has been invented, which happened to the Caribbean, you know, like 5 times over the last centuries. So something totally going out of fashion because an alternative to tourism will not be invented really soon. You sell a rather unique experience to an end user. So I want to take that as the starting point as well for the question about either specialization or diversification. So through my research, I'm not a proponent of diversification for diversification's sake, right? There's many unsuccessful examples of that in the past, and it's just very hard to develop a comparative advantage where you have none right now. On the other hand, specialization in itself is not a virtue either. So you need intelligent specialization, which actually has been researched as well under the name of speciation in the framework of island development. And I think that, you have to scrutinize the tourism destination as such, reinvent it. We've been gliding, slowly from unique towards generic, right? In terms of tourism destination, from unique recognizable destinations towards destinations and accommodations that could basically be anywhere in the world. Footloose, as Richard Butler describes them nowadays. So that is the starting point. Be more intelligent about the specialization and also intensify the product in a broader sense. So don't focus only on accommodation, but offer a broad experience of which accommodation is one part and experiences in the island and the uniqueness of the island is the other part. So yes, specialization, but no, not the generic kind that we have, interchangeable kind that we have been sliding towards over the past decades.
Thank you.
Okay. I think, Jim, do you have another question, or should I give Luke the opportunity?
Well, just a quick one, if I may, Deborah. I think this is a personal view. I'd be interested in Arjen's view.
Yeah.
I think, I've been 40 years in the Caribbean. I've always insisted that one of the problems is that everybody counts the wrong thing. They count visitor arrivals.
Exactly.
Rather than focusing on income. And that one opportunity that we have, I know that there has been some, I hate to say lip service, but there has been some effort to really refocus tourism on generating more income, higher yield. And I know many destinations are trying to implement this approach. But would you think that would be some kind of an answer, Arjen?
Well, actually, I moved to the last slide of my presentation now, where I dutifully wrote down what you just said. Measure success by total expenditure per visitor per day, as opposed to total accommodation numbers, total visitor numbers, or occupation rates, right? So it's one of my, the points I keep repeating, right? Start at the other end, start at what the island is, what the island wants to be, what kind of destination it wants, what kind of experience it wants to offer. That is the product, right? And then work your way back from there. Focus not only on accommodation, but most of all also, or not most of all, but also on everything else that visitors do and spend money on the island. So indeed, total expenditure per day is then the measuring stick, for instance, where you arrive at. But eventually you want actually less visitors who spend more, and also in a sustainable way, in a sustainable formula that is, not using up your island or threatening the quality of life of everybody who's already there, and thereby biting the tail of the product, the tourism product itself, by deteriorating the product. And obviously those islands that we're speaking about have passed that threshold already. So yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Luke Alofs. Luke, what's your
Yes.
question?
Well, it's a good use to start nasty questions with compliments. And in this case, Arjen, you didn't make it very complicated to find a few compliments. I enjoyed reading your book, and I enjoyed seeing your defense a little while ago. So that's so much for the compliments. So do me some nasty questions. No, I'm a concerned citizen. I'm a really concerned citizen. I've only been in the Caribbean for 30 years. That's way less than Jin. But I've seen Aruba change, and I didn't see a change for the better. I'm very concerned about my island, and I've known St. Maarten and know Bonaire. And one of the fundamental questions in your research is the role of governance. And you make a distinction between horizontal and vertical governance. And somewhere in the end of your book, I have written up in page 116, you can look it up. You tell us that in order to break this addiction to the mandatory growth model, we need to reinvent a new form of cooperation and collaboration between the state, the market, and civil society, NGOs. Well, that's exactly the nasty question. How are you going to do that? Because as you described, it's very clear that these signals have been there. We have been trying to diversify our economy since status aparte. We have ATA did come with intentions to build unless more is not better, better is more. There was a philosophy of ATA some 20 years ago or so. And then when the forces in the government and in the private sector are so strong, how can you create this mechanism for establishing a new model of cooperation?
Yeah.
We had the social dialogue in the cabinet of Eman. It didn't work. So what are your plans? What are your visions? What is the direction that you're pointing us towards to?
Well, the thinking has been done by several governments of different color. You mentioned the social dialogue was more pointing towards the fabric of society. You have the Agenda 2025, I'm saying from the top of my head, which was from an earlier government. Anyway, the thinking part has been done and stuff has been written down. But what is lacking, in my view, this is also, part research, part personal opinion, is the courage to have the patience to develop a long-term view and have the patience to establish long-term coalitions to get to those goals, right? Things have been governed by short-term considerations every time, right? So everybody begins with lofty long-term projections and ends with short-term considerations and short-term decisions. So every government starts with seeing the problems and setting out a vision and ends by building a new modest to be generous hotel. So the alternative is to take your time to build coalitions that transcend political parties. So must be anchored in civil society then, right? And so a common agenda, a common feeling, it must be something national that transcends, that is not a political football, and that unites, those parts of the industry that want to buy into that long-term vision and commit themselves to that. And that will take choices, because not every hotel or hospitality industry is interested in that. So that's why it's a long-term project, because you can't chase the other ones away either, not overnight at least. So you have to build a coalition where civil society and the social partners, also the labor unions, buy into, and that has clear goals, and that costs time. And time is what has been lacking, is that commitment over time and that transcending of political So one of the conclusions of my thesis is that why does it go wrong? Because every government throws away all the good work and that having been done in terms of research and recommendation and planning by the previous government. And you know, regardless of where you stand politically, the main political parties in Aruba, for instance, have all done their share, right, of good thinking and good planning. But if you reject everything the previous one did on principle, then you have to reinvent the wheel, and you never have time to drive it home.
Now we're in a different situation, I think, different than before, in this sense that both Aruba and both St. Maarten have accepted the Samoa Pathway Agreement and the 2030 SDG agenda. And the positive thing to me is that with the president, the current government in Aruba, I guess also St. Maarten, did accept a policy plan, being to adopt the SDG agenda in their policies. Do you think that that the SDG agenda could offer a way out of this addiction to the mandatory growth model?
Well, yes, not in and by itself, because the SDGs don't have a prescription medicine for that. So, but it is a very useful tool, and it may just be that we need something to peg our ideas on that indeed transcends political boundaries and is sustainable over time, right? Because the SDG agenda has been around for decades now. We used to call them, what did you used to call them again? SDGs in the past? I forgot the old name, but anyway, so it may...
Millennium Goals.
Yeah, Millennium Development Goals, thank you. Yeah, so, that has to be at least 20 years back. So, yeah, so indeed, no, yes. So I'm thinking of, less along the two lines of reduced inequality, sustainable communities. That's the kind of thing, the kind of concept, but you have to fit your own Aruban form agenda of the SDGs to and use, because it's not a cookie cutter model. SDGs, you have to apply your own agenda to it, but it might just be the thing that we need to make it unpolitical.
Thank you very much. Yep, clear.
Now, was that your only nasty question, Luc?
No.
You can do better than that, Luc.
Well, then the other question, but I don't want to, maybe Jim, no, let me do then another aspect on a question about the horizontal governance. That Aruba is part of the kingdom, St. Maarten is part of the kingdom. Can we expect anything good or not so good from being part of the kingdom? It's positive for our investment climate, but can it also be positive for our sustainable development?
That is, that's actually recognized as a vertical part of governance. Again, it's what you make of it, right? I do see, looking back, and that is part of the historical part of my research. The same kingdom has been a promoter of the tourism development even before some of the islands themselves, fully committed to it, which is interesting, and also stimulated. For instance, the first, most of the audience is too young to remember this, but one of the first steps into tourism development in Aruba was by virtue of Euroskin, getting the money from Holland to do some important infrastructural investments in the 50s and the early 60s. So so they, that link has always been there, and it is actually, the climate isn't perhaps not quite right for it right now, because we are in a junction where and I've had this conversation with islands as well as the ministry in Holland. I say, this is an opportunity actually, right? This is an opportunity to shape a common cause you have to do something with the future of tourism, one way or the other, right? And the kingdom has been a force in research, in recommendations, and in development of tourism in the past as well. So, given the fact that tourism is an industry is in crisis anyway, given the fact that we're in this boat together anyway, and the kingdom has a responsibility, whether you want it or not, whether Holland wants it or not, whether the islands want it or not, the responsibility is there as long as the kingdom exists in this form. So yes, to shape an agenda and to help find solutions that are applicable to several islands at the same time, because there's a lot more in common between not only Sint Maarten and Aruba, but also other islands in the Dutch Caribbean. And it would be a tremendous lost opportunity if that challenge wasn't picked up as an opportunity right now for actually giving substance and giving significance to the kingdom, where it has been, all confrontation, to the superficially speaking.
Yeah, that's a plea to reinvent the kingdom.
Yeah, and to find rejuvenation of the tourism product. Yeah. Very concrete goal.
Yeah, we could call that the mandatory power addiction.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Luke. I don't know if Jim, maybe any last question before I go over to the audience.
Thanks, Deborah. If I can just build on what Luke and Arjen were discussing very quickly. I was appointed Director of Tourism in Curacao in the beginning of 2001. And you recall the terrorist incident in 9/11, September of 2001. And within 2 weeks, the Minister for Kingdom Affairs from the Netherlands came to Curacao. He met with me one-on-one and said very simply, Mr. Hebbel, what do you need to rebuild the tourism industry as quickly as possible? Because it is less expensive for the Netherlands to invest here in Curacao in tourism than it is to receive a large number of citizens moving to the Netherlands who will need our care and attention. And so I think to Luke's point and Arjen's point, you may find that the Netherlands at this particular time has a vested interest in rebuilding our tourism industry as quickly as possible to prevent migration to the Netherlands.
Are you asking me if I agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I'm just asking.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just asking whether you think that's possible. Because you seem quite positive about the role the kingdom might play.
Yeah. Well, what you just said, that point of view that you just cited from back then it's rather cynical, of course, and that doesn't make it untrue though. But you start at the negative end of the consequences, but so I'd rather see it as a positive opportunity. But you're right. I mean, and it's not as if the kingdom or Holland is not prepared to pledge money to rebuilding islands. I mean, they pledged more than €500 million to recovery of Sint Maarten after the hurricanes.
Yeah.
Think what you may of how it was, operationalized and the World Bank and everything. But I mean, that doesn't take away anything from the will to actually commit. So, but it's direction that we lack, right? So it's been very, the trap that, that vertical connection is also falling in the short-term considerations trap, in that it's, short-term thinking, short-term conflicts, emotions running, determining the outcome, and that also has to do in an institutional sense. That has very much to do with how the Ministry of Kingdom Affairs in Holland operates with a lack of continuity in the people who are dealing with kingdom affairs. Yes. So yeah, but it is not that difficult to do that differently, actually, and to be courageous and to actually, you know, formulate a kingdom agenda where that kind of objectives and goals are indeed brought forward. It's not rocket science at all. I'm saying that because it has been done before.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Jim. And I'll go over now to the questions from those participating in the webinar. The first one, Arjen, and again, Jim, Luke, feel free also to answer if needed. It says the carrying capacity model implies that the volume of tourists could still be increased if there is rejuvenation with good governance. But how desirable is it to increase the volume considering other non-socioeconomic impacts, such as environmental and social cultural impacts? Arjen?
Okay, quickly rehashing the question. I don't think I necessarily agree with that quotation, because the implication that rejuvenation makes further volume growth possible is definitely not what I'm arguing in my thesis. No, it's rather the other way around. It's rather shifting very explicitly from volume, from quantity to quality. So a rejuvenation, you might actually end up with a much smaller number of tourists, maybe even with a smaller population actually in the long run, because you earn, you know, you also get more productive if you produce the same amount with less people, right? Which might just be a good idea in the long run, right? Because you don't necessarily want to be a tourism Singapore or something where every square meter is built up. That's just not feasible in any in any scenario that you really want. So yeah, rejuvenation doesn't mean some hidden path to new expansion in where you solve the problems that you get in some magical way or something. No, it's more doing less and doing it better, and thereby avoiding also the population growth that has been part and parcel of the model for so long. You're muted.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry. And the following to remark is, it is indicated by the dashed line in the talc. That's a response.
Here, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, so that was the reference to what you just said. So the same Tatiana who posed the question says it is indicated by the dashed line in the talc. So maybe you can.
Which is, okay, the number of tourists going up again. Yeah, okay, true. Yes, because this is indeed, that would indeed not be the case. This is the original Butler model, which does not necessarily apply to islands. Indeed, true that this arrow indeed points above that dashed line. That for an island with a limited surface area, that is not what rejuvenation would look like per se. No, very sharp remark. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Following question. Oh, I don't know, Luke, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, very shortly. I think that Tatiana's remark also makes me think of another paradox that we're facing in Aruba. That is the paradox between nation branding and nation building. What we do is that we brand our island as a tourist destination, but we forget to build our nation as a nation. And I think that also in relation to my first question, that this new dialogue that we should be having in Aruba and in St. Martin and in other places is, how do we see this fundamental relation with building a community in which people can be happy, healthy, and sufficiently rich, and an economy. So that's a broader discussion that I hope to be able to continue someday about the paradox of nation building and nation branding.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the next presentation coming up with Luke as a presenter, and Jim, you and Arjen could be co-facilitators. Another.
It's a very pertinent remark from Luke, because it's what I'm arguing as well. Actually, you have to start, bring the starting point back to the country, to the community, to the island. What do you want to be as an island? And that also determines what you want to offer to tourists. And the impetus, the momentum has been the other way around for the past 30, 40 years. It's been the more or less independent development of tourism that has shaped the community and has shaped the cohesion or lack thereof and the quality of life of the community. So it's basically, getting back the steering wheel of national development. And that in that Luke is completely correct. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Luke. Another question. Trying to conclude Arjen's view on diversification versus specialization, if I understood correctly, both have potential drawbacks. Then there are some of the limitations with rightfully highlighted in the presentation. If these developments were market-driven and in comparison to most islands' GDP growth and quality of life have performed relatively better to Caribbean peers that have not specialized in tourism. Is the current model not the second best solution in absence of institutional capacity to intervene in the structure of the economy? So that's the question. Does Arjen's work include an example of a first best solution that shows superior long-term results? Yes, that's a very long
Iceland,
question.
Yeah, something like Iceland. Yeah, we can't all be Iceland, but yeah, you have those very special countries who did grab the steering wheel at the right moment and did it on their own terms, right? And that, of course, like I said before, indeed, Wendell is quoting me correctly. It is, the laissez-faire used to be. Kind of a blessing, and it turned into a curse, because you can't suddenly invent or be an actively engaged government if you have no experience in that. So, but it's not impossible either, and it's definitely not impossible for Aruba, because Aruba definitely has the means, and in that also then comes back the kingdom aspect as well, right? Because that might be effective. With kingdom, I don't mean Holland, I also mean the other islands. Could share their best practices in that, and not just the islands in the kingdom for that matter, but also those successful islands who did manage their development trajectory more successfully than the laissez-faire approach that we did. So it's hard to point out, but indeed, a country like Iceland or something, they did it completely their own way. It is a tourism large, it is an island where tourism is a very important source of income, but not the only one, for sure. Yeah.
The next question, I'm not sure if you can give an answer, but the question is, where is the revenue profit of tourism since our status aparte? Where did it go?
Yeah. Well, of course, if you have foreign investors, part of the profits will always go overseas, which is, one of the flip sides of inviting so many investors from abroad. It goes with the territory, so to speak. But that has been a choice that has been made very early on to depend on foreign capital, which is unavoidable to a certain extent. But there's different kinds of foreign investors as well, and that it's about the selection. It's about the choices, that the selectivity that was never in place. So yeah, the profits went overseas for a large part. And that is one of the things you want to address, right? You want more backlinkage to the local economy in all respects. Yeah. And again, that has to be developed over time, because many countries started out that way and developed those linkages over time. That's how countries like South Korea and such got big, right? They started out with unscrupulous overseas investment and ended up with their own locally owned industries.
Yes. Now the questions, I guess Luc and Jim have the questions coming. Next question is, islands compete with large countries. Do you see the saturation in sea, sand, and sun attractions? And we need other rejuvenated attractions like an orange economy or stage authentic heritage attractions, just living history to tourists. Are hosts always happy with guests? Is the final question.
Well, that is that last bit is an eternal question. Yeah, it is a question that has been, are hosts always happy with guests? Is the question that actually is a very old question that even precedes the Butler theory that came about in 1980 or something. That's already 40 years ago. So that has been an eternal question in the land of tourism, studying of tourism. But so the saturation of sea, sand, and sun, that is one of my warnings, right? We as Aruba, as St. Martin, have been sliding from pretty unique, distinct destinations and slid towards generic products slowly but steadily. So indeed, the rejuvenated attractions, orange economy, indeed history-linked products, experiences. I mean, whatever there's a market for, and you can develop. In that sense, I'm not a technical tourism expert. I'm a development expert, but I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of and Aruba has the experience right there. There's tons of people in Aruba who have the creativity and the experience to develop things like that. Are hosts always happy with guests? Well, in Aruba, I think by comparison, they mostly are. Aruba is pretty successful in that sense, in the sense of matching or keeping a very hospitable atmosphere between host and guests. So, but definitely not always in all islands, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. So, another question: any advice on how to prevent inventing the wheel between governments?
In the sense of throwing everything away that the previous government did. Well, I went into that a little bit earlier. I think you have to cement that in institutions that are anchored in civil society and therefore independent of political color, and that live longer than the government cycle, right? It has to become an article of faith, so to speak, the course of a nation, that you can't just throw overboard if you of course, every political party in power has the right to bend it and shape it somewhat, but the end goal has to be long term. So it has to be anchored in society and groups and organizations that are steady. So in the industries, in the labor unions, in the churches, for all I care, everybody has to buy into that, and it has to become a national agenda that nobody dares to throw overboard out of political expediency.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. The theoretical argument sounds valid, and that is referring to
Randall has had it.
Yes, has a question. So, Randall has a question. It says the theoretical argument sounds valid. He was wondering if the PhD work offers a theoretical model that is quantifiable, or does it provide empirical evidence that goes beyond that of the GDP trajectory?
Oh yeah, there's a lot more empirical evidence than that just snippets that I showed. But it's a mix of quantitative and qualitative data that I used, and parts of it, you know, my research is rather, it's more the start than the end of what has to be done, right? My biggest goal is to make other researchers curious, and to make them do, hopefully inspire them somewhat here and there to do more research into those different areas that I touched upon. But what I did is, I think, in my opinion, and it's been scrutinized by people better than me, so is well-founded empirically. But I really hope that, you know, more quantitative and qualitative research will be done in the future, because I only scratched the surface, really, in my view.
Thank you. So there's work for Randall, and if he wants to do it.
Tons of work, yeah.
Tons of work, and there's also Luke, and there's Jim, so, and who else who's interested. I think this would be our last question now, which is, as you are talking about the USP of the islands, how do you suggest the island go about creating and dictating the USP, and who should be involved?
Yeah, unique selling propositions or points, USP stands for here, I think. Yeah, so indeed, dictating, well, it goes back to an earlier answer I gave, right? Once you, if you shape the value proposition that your island or your destination wants to be, then, you know, it's up to the industry to connect unique selling points to that. If you want to be, for instance, offer a historical experience, then you know, your USPs follow from that. Is if it's nature, or if it's diving, or if it's something else, then that's where that also goes back a little to diversification and specialization, because I'm a big believer in diversification within the tourism sector. So please diversify between those who seek history, those who seek nature on land, those who seek diving, those who want to go fishing, you know. Do by all means diversify among those experiences. Yeah. And I'm not the specialist on the USPs. I'm not that kind of tourism specialist. I mean, there's people 1,000 times more, you know, capable of doing that.
Yeah. So we've come to the end of the Q&A. I don't know if, before I give the word to you, if your co-panelists, either Jim or Luke, would like to add anything to what was said previously. Or not? Let me, Luke, yeah, you're the first.
Well, one thing that came to my mind, that I firmly believe that in the field of creative industries, in circular economy, and in sustainable tourism, that we can win a whole lot there in our development. And they may be some of those USPs that we were just talking about. But for the rest, no, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke, for those critical questions, and Randall as well. Jim, your last question, remarks?
No, just a quick thing. I wasn't here at the time, but I understand after the refinery closed in 1985, the government did make a very conscious decision to develop a tourism industry, Arjen, and that I didn't get the sense it was, you know, weak direction, if you like. There was a conscious decision to move in that direction.
Yes, I'm not talking about the lack of purpose in the sense of developing tourism. It was the steering, not the if. The if was clear, but the how has in that stage also hardly been managed. I've interviewed the main movers and shakers of that period of time, right? And they still, 35 years later, were amazed. They were victims of their own success. So they anticipated that from 15 projects, like 4 would succeed, and instead 14 out of 15 succeeded. And they were overwhelmed by, and they basically opened the door and invited everybody in, right? Instead of selecting who your real friends are. So,
there was a focus very much on the Northeast United States, and as a result of that, then we got the brand name hotels, and we ended up with the product that we did.
Yeah,
I can always remember as director of tourism in Curacao, the comparison between the 2 islands was quite remarkable.
No, indeed, but like I said, it's been a sliding scale of in terms of quality. So, for instance,
absolutely,
when it flipped over to mainly or predominantly, I should say, not mainly. I mean, the regular hotels were still there, but when it became more timeshare, then it already slips away from you, right? Yeah. Anyway, that was the point I was making.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thank Luke for having participated as our critical panelist during this presentation. I thank you, Arjen. I'd like to know if you have any closing, final roundup that you'd like to add to your presentation, that if you haven't as yet.
No, I just wanted to conclude with thanking everybody, especially Jim and Luke, of course, for agreeing to be the panelist, and yourself, Deborah, and everybody from the University of Aruba. And obviously our audience, because I'm seeing that still more than 30 participants are still online after more than an hour, which is pretty phenomenal. So
yes, that is.
I want to thank everybody for their input, for their questions, and for their patience. And I hope that everybody found it interesting. And I think my email address is somewhere in the...
if you go to the last slide, I think you'll be able to share that information.
So you can also go online at the University of Amsterdam to download most of my thesis. Most of it is in the in the public domain right now, and otherwise just pop me an email and then I will take it from there.
Yes. And on that note, I would like to thank all of you, indeed, as Arjen said, for having remained with us for the past hour. It was definitely a very interesting presentation to have us all think about, the future of our island and branding, as Jim said, nation building. So thank you for that. I look forward to seeing you at one of our other online presentations. And if you're not part of our mailing list, I recommend that you send an email to cll@ua.away, and any questions that you may have, also just send them there and we will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you, and I wish you a pleasant evening further, and until we see again, have a wonderful evening.